I want to do a quick video, relate some things about the subject of remission of sins, and that fan's on low, and it's hot in here, so I don't know if I can say that it's helping me enough. I just turn it up a little bit and make you listen to it. Today is, we're about an hour, I guess, or a little less from people coming over for Jasmine's birthday party, and Deandra was here, and is here, and I was talking with her a little bit earlier, and it was fun. I got to relate one of the miracle stories of my brother's apostolicness, and but I mentioned remission of sins as a subject, and I talked about it with her for a little while, and I now have aspirations of maybe bringing the subject up and talking about it more deeply with her and anyone else that might want to listen as the gathering is going on. We'll see if there's enough conversation space for that. But then I was just taking myself a feet up, back straightening break on my bed and thinking about it a little bit. And I thought, this video, if it turns out to be kind of complete and I stop wasting time here and get started on it in a minute, then it might be something that I could just put on a couple discs, and if anybody does talk with me about the subject, then I could give them the disc to review later. In John 20, I think it's John 20:22. Let me double check. Oh, that's the wrong icon. Let's not do that. Jesus shows up. I've talked about it before, actually. I have a couple really good videos that I've done on it. I have one. The first one that I did was probably maybe fall of 2014, possibly. It was just kind of giving the idea. And then about a little over a year ago, probably at the old house. Hope it's not 2 years. I think I've only been here for 1 year. I was working on the subject and trying to master all the implications of it for 4 or 5 weeks, probably at least, where it was kind of on my mind, and I did a little bit more video stuff there, and I could probably put it together in a package on YouTube. Surprised I don't see it here on my desktop. So Jesus comes back from the dead, and people are spotting him occasionally, and there's a story in John about they're coming through the closed doors. The doors are bolted or barred, and he comes into the room, appears, says peace unto you, and then tells him a breathes on him and says, like my Father sent me, I send you, which means I'm sending you as priest. Really, it is what it's going to turn out to be. I couldn't describe it, but it's not the most important thing. And then he says, and alive from the dead and return to see them in person. He says to them the doctrine originating or supporting thing that he said, the only thing that's recorded there is, whosoever sins you remit, they are remitted. Whosoever sins you retain, they are retained. And Christianity there's no way they've accidentally stayed away from it to the degree that they've stayed away from it. It has to be because they won't go that way. And what it really means is that if someone sins and you remit their sins, then heaven and God will not hold them against them, against the one whose sins are remitted, because there won't be any sins for them to hold against them. See, the thing is, you don't judge and you don't condemn and judge someone righteously when they haven't harmed anyone. So when they've harmed someone and that would be sinned, then when you judge them in a remission of sins, when you remove that, when you loose them from their condemnation burden because of those things, then there's no further judgment not only needed, but there's no further judgment place allowed, because there's nothing to decide. There's no force coming from one and force coming back from the other that you would decide on as a judge. That's what judges do. They don't just, sit there and stamp people condemned, and that's not their purpose. It's not ever the purpose of judgment. The judgment is to reestablish righteousness, reestablish peace. And so the key thing is that when you decide to remit someone's sins, then you are deciding that God is not going to possibly be in the position of being a judge for that sin and that man, because the sins are gone. Because the promise is, whosoever sins you remit, they are remitted them. You remit them, they're remitted. And it means that heaven and God remit them as well. They don't hold them. How can they hold them? The idea of pressing charges. How is a judge, any other judge, whether man or God, would be considered to be that? How would they find a place to come in and make a judgment and condemn someone when no one has accused them? And what judge is an accuser? If you're an accuser, you're not a judge, you're a condemner. And someone else would be the judge if you can't make peace with those which you accused or condemned. So there's no sensible reason for a judgment to come. And people have all for centuries, so many of them, in Christians or in Jewish, whatever, and the religion that needs to be dismantled constantly from all of them, is that they believe that the rules in the book have to be answered, and that the rules are the accuser, and then God would then be the judge, because the laws have accused. And the New Testament refutes it, and the remission of sins idea goes even farther to say that it's not righteously possible for you to come in to condemn someone who has had their sins remitted. And at first, when I was talking in 2014 in the park over by Mel's on the video that might be included with this one if you see this, I was being fascinated by the idea that there's no qualifications, there's no requirements for anybody to be anybody. There's no specific. It's not like, it doesn't say something like whosoever sins you remit, that they are remitted them if God thinks it's okay and he goes ahead and agrees with you this time. It doesn't say anything like that. It doesn't leave any place for you to say that God overrides that, because that's what he's saying, is that you remit them, they're remitted. It counts with everyone. And so it helps when you start realizing that the controversies between people where someone's harmed and judgment is required. The reason that judgment is required is because controversy is open between people. If the sins are retained, then that means the place for judgment is retained. If the sins are remitted, then they go away, and there's no mutual force for a priest or a judge to get in between and set that thing right. There's no wrong to set right when the wrong has already been set right by the remission. So really, and a big step for you, and I have to say it eventually, I might as well say it now, this means that God is never the judge. Jesus is right, and God is never the judge. Man always judges. Man harms, men defends, men fight, and men judge. And God takes their judgments as how he must view the potential for them to be guilty of sins and harms. If they can't make peace and a man intercedes and judges and sets things right, and sins remitted and taken care of and things resolved, and there's no reason for God to hold guilt after that. And the idea that men are guilty and eternally guilty is bad doctrine, and it's an accusation against God that's really not a very good place to be found, in the place of accusing God of being willing to destroy people whose sins have been remitted. I guess the question of whether Jesus dying and raising from the dead decided and made that possible. It would seem that way, but I don't really necessarily think it's true. I think it worked before this redemptive act and its effect or lack of effect. Because, if someone hurts you and then you forgive them, there was never any place for a judge to get in between you because there's no fight. And that was the case before Jesus was even heard of or died and raised. So I don't really think it's, people would presume that his redemptive work, his sacrificial work, made that possible, but I don't believe it was true. And I think I've just described it probably enough to make you, at least give you, the nuts and bolts of how you might come to the same conclusion as me if you think it over for a while. But the remission of sins idea is such a big deal. Like I mentioned, I've had probably 6 months in my lifetime, or in my ministry lifetime, I guess you'd say, and with apostolic talent and continual focus on righteousness and being completely undistracted because I wasn't sick yet then, but I didn't have anything else going on. I worked at Safeway part-time, almost full-time. Maybe it was full-time. But other than that, all I did was ride the Max around and work on God things. So I was after it as a talented apostle and righteousness expert for a long time. And I've spent 6 months taking apart the bad ideas that are refuted by it. And very much Christianity is refuted by this simple phrase. And careful not to be. I don't really know who this is for, so I probably shouldn't say that necessarily. But there was a ton of bad theology that should never be supported by Christianity that came out of the Old Testament things. Jewish theology was very unrighteous in a number of ways. I think a number of ways is probably fine. Several ways, I would think at least. So trying to hold on to what was never yours, a Jewish condemning view of God, that God was always on always on his best behavior to not snuff you because you're so cruddy, or the idea that flesh is disgusting and spirit is pure, and so God must hate those that are flesh beings. Well, then he maybe shouldn't have made flesh beings, right? But the ancient terrible conscience and condemning views of their theology, good riddance as quick as possible, and the remission of sins idea pretty much shows that God was never. There's no reason to think that God changed completely. That Jesus's influence made God change completely from Satan to a God. From Satan, a father God. He wasn't a Satan before. He wasn't waiting to kill people, and he did not hold everybody condemned in mass and without remedy. Men did that, and their views were wrong, and their views were bad theology and bad, and they're really a calumny against God's character to treat him that way, to treat God as an adversary to men, or as a prosecutor. Prosecutors are adversaries. They come to destroy men. That's what they do. Their job is to destroy men, when condemning is considered to be a cause for death, then condemning men is killing them. So how good can that be? We're going to adjust our doctrine back away from what Jesus told us so that prosecutors can feel comfortable with their attempts to kill people. That might be good enough for now. I don't know if I've left anything out. It seems like not enough details. But that man can and should, and redemption and Christianity and the views of people that Jesus being a redeemer and us being like him and us being priests, we should be hating condemnation, and for us to hate condemnation and therefore relieve those who would otherwise be condemned from our condemning, and to remit their sins and work for them to be justified. To justify people is the right thing. It's the thing that Christianity is. It's the justification of people and the removing of the opposite, the condemning false doctrines of bad theology that never applied to God the Father, were all Yahweh-based doctrines, and attempts to serve a condemning war god and to act like that made you special because you were one of the ones that he was sparing. Craziness. You can keep anybody in what I mentioned about specificity. It doesn't matter necessarily. You should consider whether it matters whether they hurt you or not, whether you were involved. Because certainly if they've hurt you and you take away your returned force and you remove the judgment possibility from them, you spare those who hurt you from being condemned. And you also keep God in heaven and any other individual from becoming a condemning judge for them, because there's no charge for them to rule on to say yes, he's condemned. But you spare other men from having the possibility of a further judgment after their life, or even after the occasion, by remitting their sins and taking the return force out of the controversy, removing the contra or the against, turned against this controversy, removing that, turning against, and turning away and turning out of the controversy and out of the fight, and dismissing it. Then that makes heaven unable to condemn them for harming you. It's extremely powerful when they've harmed you, but then, what I was mentioning, there's no specificity, there's no conditions laid out. It doesn't say you can't remit anybody's sins that you decide to remit. A righteous judgment seat of Christ, like people have predicted, for it to be real, it can only deal with people who have someone holding something against them when they departed life. And I have some questions about whether there's any restitution that can be made, so whether there's any point in having a judgment when people can't go back to their normal lives with everything fixed because they're done with their lives. It's a strange idea, actually. I don't mean that it's necessarily that it's a bad idea, but any judgment seat of Christ has to only be convened, or if it's convened and everybody's being judged one at a time or whatever, like the mythology shows, like the futurist mythology shows, then that those have to only be people who are in controversies that need a judgment, because all the times when the judgment was done by remission or by a priest or a judge dealing with that, there's no further reason for that to be something that's alive. And once you recognize that God is not waiting to condemn people for breaking rules, then it's really obvious that this judgment seat is not going to include everyone. It's not going to include me, because I haven't harmed anyone that could have a cause open against me. There'd be no righteous ability for a judge to condemn me, to put me in the place where he has to decide about justifying or condemning me, no matter if it's Jesus or a father or anybody. So, pretty big deal.